Imagine living in a world where defying authority could cost you not only your freedom, but subject you to punishments so horrifying they seem like something out of a nightmare. Welcome to the grim reality of the British Empire's justice system, a time when law was enforced with ruthless precision and a creativity rooted in cruelty. In this video, we're diving into the most disgusting and unimaginable punishment methods ever used by the British Empire. Practices designed not just to punish, but to terrify, humiliate, and control. From merciless whippings to public spectacles of death, these punishments were as calculated as they were horrifying, leaving scars not only on the victims, but on the very conscience of history. At the core of these brutal methods was the infamous Bloody Code, a legal framework during the 18th and early 19th centuries that prescribed death for over 200 offences. Minor crimes such as stealing a loaf of bread or a petty theft could lead to execution, a grim reminder that fear was the ultimate tool of control. Philosophers like Jeremy Bentham argued that such laws were meant to secure the greatest happiness for the greatest number, yet the moral cost was staggering. Across the colonies, the punishments grew even more extreme, layered with additional cruelty to maintain domination over native populations. Among the most notorious instruments of torment was the cat o' nine tails, a whip with 9 knotted lashes that tore flesh with merciless efficiency. Used in the navy and penal colonies, it became a symbol of fear, a warning that resistance would be met not with mercy, but with excruciating pain. So are you ready to peer into a dark past where justice wasn't just served, it was inflicted? Stay with us as we uncover the horrifying methods that shaped the British Empire and left an indelible mark on history. The world the British Empire built was one of order enforced with iron and fear, a place where every shadow could conceal a watchful eye, every alley a trap, and every moment a reminder that freedom was a fragile illusion. In the bustling port city, the morning fog hung thick over cobblestone streets, curling through the narrow lanes like a ghost. Merchants shouted their wares, horses clattered on worn stones, and the distant tolling of church bells marked another day in a society where law and punishment were inseparable. Among the throngs of people moving through the marketplace, a young sailor named Thomas moved with quiet purpose. His clothes were worn, patched in multiple places, but his eyes carried a glimmer of determination, a spark of hope that his life could one day be more than just survival under the Empire's harsh thumb. Thomas had grown up under the constant drumbeat of rules that seemed designed not to protect, but to suppress. In his early years, he had watched his father disappear into the depths of a naval prison, accused of theft he did not commit. The accusation had been enough. The Empire did not require proof, it required obedience. The sight of the iron gate slamming behind his father's back left a mark on Thomas's soul, a seed of fear that would grow alongside his own longing for freedom. Every minor infraction, every whispered word of defiance carried the weight of potential devastation. The port itself was a city of contrasts. Ships from distant lands brought riches and rumors of exotic worlds, yet beneath the gilded sails and polished brass, hunger and cruelty were commonplace. Slaves from the colonies worked in chains, their bodies scarred by whippings and beatings. Servants hurried through the streets, carrying the burdens of the wealthy, while soldiers patrolled with a vigilant eye, ensuring that no one stepped beyond the lines the law had drawn. This was a world where the law was not a guide but a weapon, wielded with precision to maintain control over all who lived under the Empire's shadow. Thomas's daily life was a delicate balance between obedience and quiet rebellion. He worked on a merchant vessel, loading crates of spices, textiles, and sugar, careful to follow every command, yet secretly keeping a journal hidden beneath his mattress. In its pages, he recorded what he saw. The unfairness, the brutality, the endless parade of punishments that seemed to define life in the Empire. He wrote of a man flogged for failing to salute correctly, a woman forced to stand in stocks for days because she had been too slow to pay a tax, and the whispers of executions carried out at dawn before the city even stirred. Every story, every punishment, was a lesson in the consequences of disobedience. At the heart of these horrors lay the infamous Bloody Code, a legal framework so severe it could make the most minor misstep a death sentence. Over 200 offences carried the ultimate punishment, and for Thomas and those like him, the line between compliance and condemnation was perilously thin. Stealing a loaf of bread, speaking disrespectfully to a superior, even being in the wrong place at the wrong time could seal one's fate. The law was a constant, looming presence, shaping every decision, every movement, every breath. And the empire did not reserve its cruelty solely for its own citizens. Across distant colonies, the punishments were intensified, designed to break spirits, enforce dominance, and suppress resistance. One morning, as Thomas unloaded a shipment of sugar from a docked vessel, he noticed a commotion near the eastern end of the port. A crowd had gathered, their faces a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. Soldiers had restrained a young boy, barely older than Thomas, and were preparing him for public punishment. The boy had been caught attempting to steal bread, a crime minor in nature, yet monumental under the bloody code. Thomas could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating, as whispers of what was about to unfold rippled through the crowd. He tried to look away, focusing on his work, yet he could not escape the scene. The boy's eyes, wide with terror, met Thomas's for a fleeting moment, and in that instant a wave of empathy surged through him. He imagined his own father in similar chains, the searing pain of the lash, the humiliation of being displayed as an example. The memory of those iron gates and the echoing cries of despair from the prison yard returned with vivid clarity. Thomas knew that the law was indifferent to innocence, that justice was measured not in fairness, but in the capacity to instill fear. As the soldiers lifted the boy onto a wooden platform, Thomas's mind drifted to the infamous instruments of punishment he had heard whispers about. The cat-o'-nine-tails, a whip of 9 knotted cords designed to shred flesh. The pillory, a wooden framework that immobilized its victims while exposing them to the scorn and violence of the public. And the stocks, where hands and feet were bound for hours or days, leaving the punished exposed to weather, ridicule, and relentless torment. The very names of these tools evoked dread, their use as ceremonial as it was punitive, transforming punishment into spectacle. Thomas's life had been a continuous dance around such horrors, learning the precise line between compliance and rebellion, mastering the art of invisibility. Yet he could not ignore the injustice around him. Every day he witnessed the empire's ruthless efficiency, a system where fear was currency, cruelty was law, and survival depended on submission. The city itself seemed to breathe with the weight of oppression, the narrow streets echoing with the clatter of boots, the smell of smoke and salt mingling in the air, the distant cries of those subjected to punishment. In the shadows of the port, Thomas also observed small acts of quiet defiance. A dockworker, hiding stolen bread to feed his starving family. A young woman slipping a note to a fellow servant, warning of impending punishment. A sailor refusing to speak against a fellow crewmate, despite knowing the consequences. These moments, fleeting and fragile, were beacons of humanity in a system designed to strip it away. They reminded Thomas that even within the empire's iron grip, courage and compassion persisted, though often at unimaginable cost. By midday, the boy's punishment commenced. The crowd fell silent as the soldiers lifted the cat-o'-nine-tails, its 9 cords glinting in the harsh sunlight. Thomas's stomach churned, and though he averted his eyes, he could not escape the sounds. The crack of the lash, the sharp gasps, the stifled screams. It was a cruel reminder that in this world, innocence offered no shield, and mercy was a luxury the empire did not afford. Thomas returned to his work, hands trembling slightly as he stacked crates of sugar and textiles. He thought of his father, of the countless souls who had suffered in silence, and of the writings he secretly kept hidden in his journal. Each entry was a testament to endurance, a record of cruelty, and a silent act of rebellion. The world he lived in demanded obedience, yet in the quiet moments he allowed himself to imagine another life, one where justice was fairness, where punishment was measured, and where fear did not dictate. Every heartbeat. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the port, Thomas paused to watch the city. Smoke rose from chimneys, mingling with the fading light, creating an eerie tableau that mirrored the tension in his own chest. He knew that the coming days would demand courage beyond what he had ever summoned, that the empire's laws would continue to test the limits of his endurance and morality. Yet within him, a seed of determination had taken root, a quiet, unyielding resolve to survive, witness, and perhaps one day expose the full horror of a system designed not to uphold justice but to instill terror. The setup closed not with action, but with anticipation. The audience now understood Thomas's world, a society steeped in cruelty, ruled by an unyielding legal code, and defined by the ever-present threat of punishment. They were introduced to a character whose humanity, courage, and fear mirrored the lives of countless victims of the Empire's brutal methods. And at the edge of this dark world, the seeds of rising conflict had already been sown. The stage was set, the tension palpable, and the story was only beginning. The morning air had a biting chill that seeped through the layers of clothing worn by the dockworkers, sailors, and merchants moving through the cobblestone streets. Thomas could feel it in his bones, a subtle reminder that danger and cruelty were never far away in the world of the British Empire. The port, usually bustling with activity, felt different today, as if the city itself had drawn a sharp breath, anticipating the horrors about to unfold. Whispers floated on the wind, rumors of a man who had been flogged for nothing more than a missed order, a boy whose hands were bound in the stocks for daring to question a merchant's pricing. The tales were enough to make anyone's stomach turn, yet Thomas could not look away. The first incident came suddenly. From the corner of his eye, Thomas noticed a group of soldiers dragging a man through the marketplace. The man's clothes were torn, his face streaked with dirt and blood, and his cries pierced the air with an intensity that made even hardened sailors flinch. The crowd parted instinctively, a wave of fear washing over them. Thomas's heart pounded as he watched the man lifted onto a wooden platform, a cat-o'-nine-tails in the hands of a soldier. Each swing of the whip was precise, deliberate, leaving deep crimson lines across the man's back. The sound of the lash cracking against skin was sickening, echoing off the surrounding buildings like a sinister drumbeat. The crowd murmured, some averting their eyes, others frozen in grim fascination. Thomas felt his own hands tremble as he realized how close he was to witnessing a life being torn apart for a crime that, in any reasonable world, would not warrant such punishment. The Empire's cruelty did not limit itself to physical torment. Public humiliation was a weapon just as sharp as the lash. A young woman, accused of stealing silver spoons, was forced into the pillory at the center of the town square. Her head and hands were locked into the rigid wood, leaving her exposed to the jeers, stones, and rotten food flung by the crowd. Thomas could see the terror in her eyes, the desperation in her movements, yet the soldiers ignored her cries. The spectacle was a lesson for all who dared defy authority, a vivid reminder that the law existed not to serve justice, but to instill fear. As Thomas moved through the port, his gaze fell upon the colonial quarters, where the Empire's oppression extended far beyond England's borders. Indigenous laborers were being forced to work in the docks under brutal conditions, overseen by armed guards, who punished even minor delays with vicious efficiency. A young native boy, no older than 14, had stumbled while carrying a heavy crate. The guard struck him repeatedly with a cane, each blow measured and deliberate. The boy fell to the ground, sobbing, yet when he tried to rise, another strike sent him sprawling again. Thomas's chest tightened as he watched, powerless to intervene. These punishments were not isolated incidents. They were a daily reality for countless innocents whose only crime was existing under the Empire's dominion. The tension escalated further when Thomas himself became a target. A minor infraction, failing to salute an officer properly, had drawn attention, and whispers of possible punishment reached his ears. His hands shook as he loaded crates, every movement measured with extreme caution. The knowledge that even the slightest mistake could result in pain, humiliation, or death weighed heavily on him. In that moment, Thomas realized that the Empire's laws were not abstract concepts. They were chains that bound every aspect of life, controlling behavior through terror and cruelty. Amidst the fear and tension, Thomas began to notice the small acts of defiance that flickered like candle flames in the darkness. A sailor hiding stolen bread to feed a fellow crew member, a servant slipping a note warning of a forthcoming punishment, a young boy refusing to reveal the whereabouts of another accused individual, despite knowing he might face lashes himself. These acts, though fleeting and fragile, were reminders that even in the most oppressive systems, the human spirit could resist. They fueled a growing fire within Thomas, a quiet determination that perhaps survival alone was not enough. Perhaps witnessing, recording, and remembering were acts of resistance in themselves. The escalation reached a new level when Thomas stumbled upon a colonial punishment that defied comprehension. A man accused of rebellion against the empire was being subjected to the breaking wheel, a device designed to crush bones and elongate suffering. The man's limbs were strapped to the wooden spokes, and the executioner lifted a heavy iron bar, preparing to deliver the first of many blows. The crowd stood silent, their collective breath held as the bar fell again and again, each impact producing a sickening crack that reverberated across the square. Thomas felt bile rise in his throat as he watched the man's agony, the methodical cruelty of the execution, a stark reminder that the empire's power was absolute and unyielding. Yet even as the horrors unfolded around him, Thomas could not turn away. He observed everything with meticulous detail, his mind cataloguing each act of cruelty, each reaction of the crowd, each moment of fear or defiance. He understood that these events were more than punishment. They were theater, performances designed to reinforce control and suppress resistance. The people were both audience and participant, bound by fear yet compelled to witness the consequences of disobedience. The emotional stakes grew even higher when a friend of Thomas's, a fellow sailor named Edward, was accused of smuggling contraband from a colonial port. Edward's punishment was not immediate execution, but a slow, calculated torment. He was placed in stocks, left exposed to the elements and the mockery of the crowd. Thomas watched as Edward's hands and feet swelled, bruises forming under the constant pressure, while the sun beat down mercilessly upon him. The screams, the moans, the pleading eyes, all etched themselves into Thomas's memory. He felt a surge of anger and helplessness, a desire to intervene clashing with the terrifying reality of Empire's omnipresent power. In the shadowed alleys behind the port, Thomas began to notice the subtler forms of cruelty. Servants were starved, beaten for minor mistakes and humiliated for failing to meet impossible expectations. Indigenous workers were forced to endure backbreaking labor with no respite, their voices silenced by fear. The Empire's punishment was not always immediate or spectacular. Often it was slow, insidious, and relentless. Each day brought a new lesson in suffering, each hour a reminder that compliance was survival, and resistance was a death sentence. Thomas's internal struggle mirrored the chaos around him. He wrestled with guilt for surviving while others suffered, with anger at the injustice he could neither prevent nor punish, and with a creeping realization that the world he inhabited was designed to crush humanity. The emotional tension built within him, coiling like a spring, preparing for a moment when action or confrontation would be inevitable. By the end of the 5th day, Thomas found himself at a critical turning point. The port had become a stage of cruelty, a theater of punishment, and he was now a participant in ways he could not ignore. A notice had been posted accusing him of minor theft, a pretext perhaps, or a test of the Empire's grip over his life. The fear that had always lurked in the background was now a tangible weight pressing against his chest. Every movement, every glance, every breath could be interpreted as defiance. The rising action had reached its peak. Thomas was no longer merely a witness to injustice. He was on the precipice of it. As dusk fell, painting the port in shades of crimson and shadow, Thomas retreated to a quiet corner, his mind racing. The events of the week, the floggings, the stocks, the breaking wheel, the slow torment of his friend, had transformed fear into something sharper: resolve. He understood that the horrors he had witnessed were not random acts of cruelty, but calculated mechanisms of control, designed to break spirits and enforce obedience. And yet within him, a flicker of defiance remained, small but resolute, waiting for the moment when it could no longer be contained. The rising action closed with Thomas standing at the edge of inevitability. The Empire's machinery of punishment loomed larger than ever, and he could sense that the most horrifying moments were still ahead. Every shadow seemed darker, every glance more dangerous, and every sound a potential threat. The audience, now fully immersed in the world of the British Empire, felt the tension tighten around them, knowing that the climax, where fear, cruelty, and human endurance collide, was imminent. The stage was set. The emotional stakes had been raised, and Thomas, caught between survival and defiance, was poised on the brink of history's darkest spectacle. The dawn broke cold and grey over the port, a muted sun casting long shadows across the cobblestones, and the city seemed to hold its breath. Thomas could feel the weight of the Empire pressing down on every soul in the streets. He had survived the fear, witnessed the cruelty and endured the tension of the rising days. But now he faced a moment that would define everything, the climax of terror, punishment, and human endurance. It began with a summons. Thomas, trembling yet determined, was directed toward the central square, where the Empire displayed its power in the most deliberate, calculated, and horrifying ways. Soldiers lined the streets, their polished boots glinting in the pale light, weapons at the ready and their eyes cold with indifference. At the center of the square stood a platform, raised high, with the infamous instruments of punishment arrayed like trophies of suffering, the cat-o'-nine-tails, the pillory and the stocks alongside newer, more exotic tools that had been imported from the colonies. Thomas's heart raced as he realized that this display was not for a distant observer. It was for him. He had been accused, as rumored, of minor theft, a pretext, a calculated step in the Empire's machinery designed to remind him that even survival came at a price. The crowd had gathered, thousands of faces pressed against barriers, some curious, some horrified, some eager to witness the enforcement of law. Whispers spread through the air like smoke. This was the day justice or cruelty would be rendered visible to all. The first act was the flogging, performed on a man accused of desertion from the Navy. The cat-o'-nine-tails, with its 9 knotted cords, struck with precision, ripping through fabric and skin alike. Thomas could see the man's back turn crimson almost instantly, the flesh beneath torn in gruesome streaks. Every strike was accompanied by the crowd's collective gasp, the sickening crack echoing off surrounding buildings, bouncing like a sinister drumbeat. The man screamed, his voice hoarse, blending terror and pain into a symphony of suffering. Thomas felt bile rise in his throat, yet he could not look away. He understood more vividly than ever that the Empire's power was absolute. Pain was the language it spoke, and fear the currency it demanded. Next came the stocks. A young woman accused of petty theft was bound with her hands and feet immobilized. The crowd jeered, throwing rotten food, stones, and insults, their faces a mask of schadenfreude. She flinched with every blow, every insult, every splash of filth. Thomas watched, his chest tightening, his stomach churning, yet he knew this was only the beginning. The pillory followed, a device designed to break not only the body but the spirit. Victims were exposed, humiliated, and left for hours or even days at the mercy of weather, insects, and the unrelenting eyes of the public. Then came the colonial punishments, methods so extreme they seemed almost surreal. Thomas's gaze was drawn to a man from one of the distant colonies, accused of rebellion. He was strapped to the breaking wheel, a device designed to crush limbs slowly and methodically. The executioner raised a heavy iron bar, and with each deliberate strike the man's body contorted, his bones fracturing under the calculated force. The crowd fell silent, the horror too immense to speak. Thomas felt a shiver run down his spine as he realized that the Empire's cruelty had no bounds, no limit, and no mercy. Thomas's own trial was swift. The accusation of theft was minor, but the punishment was designed to terrify. He was first placed in the stocks, his hands and feet secured, exposed to the elements and the crowd's scrutiny. A gust of wind carried the scent of salt, sweat, and fear, mingling with the cries of those already punished. He could feel every stare, every whispered word, every glance of judgment pressing down on him. It was a lesson, a warning. Survival required submission, obedience, and fear. But the Empire's ingenuity and cruelty did not end there. Thomas was then subjected to a punishment designed to humiliate and terrify simultaneously. The drum of shame, a cylindrical wooden device that encased the victim, forcing them to walk through the streets while trapped inside, the crowd free to jeer, throw objects, and mock. Thomas could feel the tight wood pressing against his chest, restricting his breath, each step a reminder that freedom was a fragile illusion. The sound of the drum rolling over cobblestones, the jeers of the crowd, and the distant cries of others being punished created a symphony of terror, each note resonating with the power the Empire wielded over life itself. Throughout the ordeal, Thomas's mind was a maelstrom of fear, anger, and defiance. He remembered the faces of friends, of innocents, of those who had suffered under the Empire's watchful eye. He understood that the system was not designed merely to punish. It was a performance, a spectacle, a lesson etched into the very soul of every witness. Each act of cruelty, no matter how small, reinforced the hierarchy, the power, and the terror that defined the empire. Then came the most infamous instrument of punishment he had ever witnessed, the cat-o'-nine-tails in its most extreme form. The man accused of mutiny was lashed repeatedly, the cords tearing flesh with merciless precision. Thomas could see the deep red tracks forming on the man's back, smell the iron tang of blood mingled with sweat, and hear the raw, guttural cries that rose from him. The crowd, hypnotized by fear and fascination, watched silently. The punishment was as much a psychological weapon as a physical one, demonstrating that disobedience would not just be corrected, it would be obliterated. Time became a blur. Thomas was moved from the stocks to the pillory, subjected to the jeers and insults of the crowd, then finally forced to endure the drum of shame, a cylindrical cage rolling him through the city streets. Each moment stretched endlessly, every second a test of endurance, courage, and the human spirit. He felt the weight of the empire pressing on him, a physical and emotional burden that threatened to crush him. Yet within the terror a spark remained, a fragile but undeniable determination to survive, to witness, and to remember. Amid the chaos, Thomas observed the subtle acts of resistance around him. A servant slipped a note to a fellow victim, warning of an impending punishment. A native laborer, despite being beaten, refused to name a companion. These acts, small and seemingly insignificant, were powerful statements of humanity amidst orchestrated cruelty. They reminded Thomas that even in the darkest systems, courage persisted, flickering like a candle against the oppressive night. The climax reached its peak when Thomas was finally confronted with a choice: obedience or defiance, survival or moral resistance. A final punishment awaited him, more psychological than physical, a staged public execution meant to terrorize and break his spirit. The executioner raised a ceremonial weapon, its purpose symbolic as much as punitive. Thomas felt every heartbeat echo through his chest, every breath tight in his lungs. In that suspended moment, he realized the essence of the empire's control. It was not the lash, the stocks, or the breaking wheel alone that instilled fear. It was the certainty that resistance, even thought itself, carried consequences beyond comprehension. And yet amidst the horror a profound clarity emerged. Thomas understood that the empire's cruelty could shape bodies, but it could not fully subjugate the mind. He clung to memories of defiance, of compassion, of humanity, knowing that survival demanded more than fear. It required vigilance, endurance, and the courage to witness the truth. The audience, fully immersed in the horror, felt the weight of the climax, the physical agony, the psychological torment, and the moral complexity of a world governed by terror. As the final act concluded, the city seemed to exhale collectively, a momentary pause in the relentless rhythm of punishment and fear. Thomas, bruised, battered, and humiliated, had endured the empire's most extreme methods, yet within him a spark of resistance remained. The climax had shattered bodies, terrified minds, and exposed the full machinery of the British Empire's cruelty. And in its aftermath, a question lingered. What does it mean to survive a system designed to crush humanity, and what responsibility does a witness hold in remembering and exposing the truth? The stage was now set for resolution, for reflection, and for the impact that such horrors leave upon both individual and collective memory. Thomas had crossed the threshold of suffering, the apex of cruelty, and the audience, having traveled with him through every harrowing moment, was ready to confront the consequences, the story's final reckoning and takeaway. The aftermath of the British Empire's punishments left scars far beyond the body. Thomas, bruised and exhausted, bore witness to cruelty designed to terrify and control. Yet within him burned a quiet defiance, a resolve to remember, survive, and honor those who suffered. The empire could break bodies, humiliate, and oppress, but it could not crush conscience, courage, or memory. Every lash, every humiliation, every injustice became a lesson in resilience. History's darkest moments remind us that witnessing, remembering, and resisting are acts of power. What would you do if faced with a system built to destroy your humanity?